I thought I would tell you a little bit about my interest in how this all came about in my studying of how I can call him Bill. I never did call him that. I always called him Dean Wurster. Because when I came to Cal in 1958 to start teaching, and I was introduced to Dean Wurster by Vernon DeMars, who many of you might have known as well, who was a wonderful teacher and the architect of the Student Union Complex. Bill Wurster sort of said, well, it's very good to have you come, and I'm just delighted that you're going to live in Berkeley. And of course, I had moved here to move to San Francisco. And with that, he reached in his pocket and handed me a set of keys. And he said, I think you really will like this apartment complex. It's very close by, and please go see it. It was designed by Roger Lee, one of our graduates. And so I went, and it was perfect, duplex. Unbeknownst to me, it was about 3 minutes from his house. And that changed my life, really, essentially, as a very young person starting teaching at Berkeley, because Bill Wurster sort of took me under his wing, and his wife, who was a very famous planner, Catherine Bauer Wurster, they had just returned in 1957 from a round-the-world trip, and they were in the throes of entertaining many, many people who came through to see the dean and to admire his work, which was by then extensive. And some of you probably realize that while he was dean, he was also the head of a very large architectural firm in San Francisco called Wurster, Bernardi and Emmons, and his two partners were Theodore Bernardi and Don Emmons. Caitlin will explain a little bit more about that aspect of our studies. What I was put into the marvelous opportunity to be was the sort of fill-in person on Friday night dinners. Catherine would call and say, we want you for dinner, please come. And so you'd go, and you'd never know who you're going to sit with. I sat with Adlai Stevenson, with princes, potentates, architects from all over the world. It was just an enormously wonderful learning experience for me. And so my career sort of started off being very interested in Bill Wurster. I didn't call him that. I still find it a little difficult to do. But anyway, what I also was called upon to do was I had a nice car, and so he would like to have his guests be shown his houses all up and down the peninsula here in Berkeley and up and down the peninsula. So I would get to go on Saturdays and drive him around town, and drive him and show houses. And he had this wonderful thing of just going up and knocking on the door. It didn't make any difference where it was. And they would say, oh, you're Bill Wurster, my goodness, how wonderful to see you. And so we'd all go marching in. And this continued well into just before he died. My interest was really, I had seen a house up on Stonewall, which some of you may know, which is now owned by Ray Lisshay, which was Gerald Hager's house. It was the first Wurster house I ever saw. And there was something very traditional about it, vernacular you might say, but something which was very unique and easygoing and not stylistically imposed upon. And I began to look at his work very carefully and studying it. And at the same time, what happened is that I was called by the Wurster, Bernardi and Emmons office saying they were going to get rid of the Wurster drawings and the Wurster correspondence from 1927 to 1950. And they were going to throw it away. And I said, no, you're not. And went and made arrangements to have it all brought to Berkeley and put in my office where it was for many years before it went into the archives where it rightly belongs. That gave me a chance to really study things with my own pace, really, basically. And I had a lot of people begin to help me, and Caitlin became one of the foremost people to really engage me and engage herself in the study of Wurster's work. And this went on for a long time, and most recently we have now published a select group of houses that we really chose from many, many that were available because we really found a mutual understanding of what those houses represent to us and into, I think, his life. And when he died, I was very sad, but at the same time, he'd lived a very good life. So my my own personal life was directly affected by him, and the study of his work was even more wonderful and more interesting over the years. So I'm going to let Caitlin talk.
And I had at that point been a design student in the graduate program at Berkeley and had worked with the archives and had been brought up in kind of the legacy of Wurster from architectural parents, and realized that the story needed to be told, and it hadn't been told well up until that point in my mind. It was basically a black and white world, that Wurster was presented in, which were the photos that were beautifully done and taken in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. My keen interest was to present a book that was verbally and visually accessible in terms of its analysis, its photography, drawings, and which could provide a broader inspiration than the limited collection that I had seen before. Many of you know, or are pretty sure you know, who Wurster was, but for the sake of clarity, I want to tell you a short story about who he was. He was born 116 years ago today. It's his birthday today, so it seems apt to start our book talks today. That was 1895. He was a native son of California, and this is really important to understand because as he developed, all of his other colleagues were reared in an aesthetic that was based in another setting. So there were no other kind of California-based architects that rose up at the same time as him. Before that, everyone had come from Philadelphia or New York or from Austria or from somewhere else. And so I think this is really important because it speaks to his particular relationship to the land, to the climate, to the people, and to the lifestyle of California. And I propose kind of a tricky label, which I think is debatable, but I propose it, which is that Wurster is California's first modernist. But I say that in the way that he defined modernism, which is meaning of today, not necessarily a style. Could you change the slide? Wurster went to the only good school in California. Can you change the slide? And the only one with an architecture department. There he is, in the early teens at the top there. And he studied at a school that was directed by John Galen Howard. Could you change the slide? Here's John Galen Howard. And which taught in the traditional system that was used throughout the United States at the time, which was formulated in Paris's École des Beaux-Arts. And that was a method that emphasized the understanding of planning and detailing of architecture. Can you change the slide, please? As represented in Imperial, Roman, and French and Baroque architecture. A student's education then was not, as much as it is today, can you change the slide, please? Based on an understanding of the actual environment, and social factors of a site, program, and client were not necessarily a consideration. You can change the slide again. Oh. Can you go back one? Okay, yes, you can change it. Not in order. After graduation, Wurster worked for several firms in San Francisco and Sacramento, learning the practice. He worked on filtration plants. Here's one in San Leandro he did. Tollways, high schools, and a few moonlight residential projects. This one was a sleeping porch. And the next one, please. And a house in Sacramento for the McKim family. This and a series of other projects allowed him to be easily licensed in 1923. Can you change that? So after he got licensed, he immediately went to Europe, which is what all young architects would do at the time, and probably still do. And if you can change the slide. He traveled with classmates from Berkeley, and he quickly threw away all the historical guidebooks, and instead, and those are his words in his journal, he threw them away, and focused instead on buildings that reflected a more vernacular response to their condition. His journals chronicle wonderful encounters, including spending a day with Ebenezer Howard, the famed planner, whose garden cities, planning theories, emphasizing the importance of green beltways, shaped England's suburban development. If you can change the slide, please. Returning to the United States, Wurster went to New York to seek work with a large, successful practice, which is what also young architects would do at the time. He thought about working for McKim, Mead & White, but instead was directed by his professors to work for Delano and Aldrich. This is a project he did for them. Oops, sorry. You can keep it there.
Keep going?
Yeah, that's fine. Delano gave him a loan to start his own practice, and he returned to California. And Delano also gave him quite a few very good referrals. This is the house that Dick saw that was particularly important, the Hager family. And these referrals provided him with an immediate and continued work of clients of means and reputation. Change the slide again. And then again. In 1927, Wurster began working with the Gregory family, and this is the famed Gregory farmhouse, which many of you know. But I'm not going to go into detail about projects in this talk. I'm just going to talk about him and his ideas, and then we can talk after that. And you can change the slide. In addition, he also started working with Marion Hollins, who was a famous golfer and golf course developer, in designing the architecture, you can change again, of the Pasatiempo Country Club. You can change it again. Wurster's practice quickly grew to be one of the most well-known practices in California. And this is a picture of the Gregory farmhouse on Sunset Magazine. And his reputation was nationally respected, though through broad exposure in well-read consumer and professional magazines. So these three pictures, we'd like to kind of use, and then we'll just flash images of the Gregory farmhouse, the Dondo Recreation House, and what's called the Walters Ferryboat House, because it was designed kind of with a ferryboat aesthetic. Just as I'm talking to explain his big concepts, I'm not going to talk about them so much. So, you can change the slide, please. William Wurster sensed unique qualities in the geography and social fabric of the San Francisco Bay Area and its environs. And as a native of the region, he was particularly compelled to convey its character in his architecture. Wurster's regional emphasis was similar to the general concerns of thoughtful architects everywhere: features of site and climate and the personal needs of the client. Change it again. Must inform the design approach. Yet Wurster's singular interpretation of these considerations distinguished him from his contemporaries. You can change it. His formal training, combined with his rural upbringing and the expansive possibilities of the 20th century, shaped a style of architecture that is distinctly Californian. You can change it again. Wurster solved architectural problems with a quiet, understated elegance. You can change it again. He became intimately involved with his clients' desires, and their homes and their offices were a response to his understanding of their needs. You can change it again. And perhaps more than anything, to the way people lived in California. He imbued very simple things with gracefulness, approaching a window detail with as much care as a primary living space. His rooms didn't rely on formal geometry or style, and if there was a consistent element in his work, it was simplicity. To paraphrase his wife and the noted planner, Catherine Bauer Wurster, it didn't make any difference what a project cost, it would never show. Many of Wurster's projects are considered modern architecture, but not because of a conscious determination of style on his part. Wurster's goal was always to interpret his clients' desires in a simple and elegant way. His houses required only the most basic construction methods, and they didn't demand unusual skills. Their refinement relied on a deep, practical knowledge of building that was passed along from carpenter to carpenter. Wurster's sensibilities dovetailed perfectly with his style of building. He was able to pay attention to the smallest of details, yet never had to compromise his vision, nor that of his client. And because building traditions varied from region to region, he customized each project to fit the particulars of the site and blend faultlessly with the surrounding terrain. Studying Wurster's work, especially his houses, over his 40 years of practice, presents a rare opportunity to explore his tremendous breadth of design elements and follow his development as an architect. So what's missing from the talk tonight, though, is a discussion of his work in education, which was very important. He was fundamental in the shift of architectural education away from the Beaux-Arts tradition and towards a more integrated understanding of the environment and the role of the building within it. In addition, our talk doesn't cover at all the work that he did with his two partners, Theodore Bernardi and Don Emmons, which was fundamentally important as well to the shaping kind of the urban fabric of the whole country. But that is really a topic of its own, and one that we had to choose in doing this book to kind of to touch on lightly and know that it needs much more in-depth analysis.